websites for perusal at your leisure. So thank you all for coming to Privilege, Oppression, Microaggressions. Oh my! That is our presentation that we wanted to do specifically today because it's a special day. Martin Luther King was born on the 15th, but this is the day that we celebrate his birthday. And it's really important to us that we honor him by supporting justice and equity and getting out there and doing something. So thank you all for being here. My name is Dr. Jessica Shore, and I am the president of the Nava Center. I'm the director of psychotherapy services at the outpatient psychiatry clinic at Penn Medicine, and also an associate professor there. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm really excited to be here because it's one of the goals of the Nava Center, which is a nonprofit that I've started, and one of my personal goals is to increase human equity and helping people to understand their role in it. So I'm going to have my co-presenter, Dr. Ewurama Sackey, introduce herself, and then I'm going to go over some just kind of ground rules for today.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Ewurama Sackey. Is it slow? Okay.
You're good. Oh, now I can't hear you at all. Now you're muted.
Okay, I think there was a bit of a drag with my earbuds. But hi everyone, my name is Ewurama Sackey. I am a psychiatry resident, fourth year at Penn, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And thank you, Jessica, for inviting me again to do a presentation with you. We've done a few of these, and they've been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Ewurama. So for those of you that would like to, you can turn on captions on the bottom of your screen. If you hover on the bottom, there's a turn on captions area. So that will potentially make it easier for folks. I'm going to turn on captions. I'm not sure if anybody else will be able to see them. I don't understand Google at all, but for the purposes of the presentation, I want them to be on there. And if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Some of you asked awesome questions in your sign up, and we're going to try to get to them throughout today. But if we don't, it just didn't fit into our training. So if you do come up with new questions that you feel like fit into what we're doing today, please feel free to type them in the chat and we will get to them as we can. All right. So what is privilege? Privilege is, and I'm going to really annoyingly read this slide because it's really important information. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary says that privilege is a right or immunity granted as a peculiar benefit, advantage, or favor. The National Conference for Community and Justice says that privilege is unearned access to resources like social power that are only readily available to some people because of their social group membership. An advantage or immunity granted to or enjoyed by one societal group above and beyond the common advantages of all other groups. Privilege is often invisible to those who have it. And Ewurama Ojo she's an author and she wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, one of my favorite books. She said privilege in the social justice context is an advantage or a set of advantages that you have that others do not. So you can see that these are slightly different definitions, right? The Merriam-Webster is pretty basic. And then the National Conference for Community and Justice and a human being's definition of privilege are really a little bit more of what we're going to be talking about today, which is this unearned privilege that we have. So privilege operates in a way that it's granted, it's not earned. It is not something that you get to earn. People give it to you. Society gives it to you based on a few different parts of your identities. And so, for example, while there are some groups who en masse hold more privilege more often than others, every single human being has privilege at some point. So in an example, if a white male goes to see a black female doctor, in that specific situation, the black female doctor may hold more privilege than the white male because in that situation, the patient is at a little bit of a disadvantage over the doctor who is an expert on that situation. Again, not always, but there are different situations. And so the important thing to realize is that context really matters. And when we talk about what that looks like, we're talking specifically about what goes on in the United States, because as much of a world traveler as I am, I really can't speak to privilege in other spaces. I can only speak to in the US. And it's important because that's where we all live. So when we think about context, we're thinking about all of these different identities, right? If you look at this, these are a lot of different bubbles. And if we were able to make it into a GIF, they would be like ebbing and flowing, right? Moving back and forth, because they do all the time. Different parts of our identities hold different space at different times. And so when you are, just admitting people, when you're looking at your identity, you are not one thing. You are not just the color of your skin. You are not just your gender. You are all of these things. And it's important to look at these and to know that, like we were talking about, the different contexts really speak to the different amounts of privilege or how our privilege is being used or how we are using our privilege in that moment. So here's a list of a whole bunch of pretty typically privileged groups in the US. And when we think about intersectionality, that's all of these things, right? You can be one of these things, you can be many of these things, you can be some of these things at different times, right? Some of them are movable, some of them are not. And this list is far from exhaustive, but we wanted to show you these different groupings to show that there are these different places where people hold privilege and may not even know it. Because what we know about privilege is that sometimes we don't even recognize that we have it. Privilege is often invisible, and people who hold it sometimes think that this is just how it is, right? This is the right way to be or the best way to be, when really it's just a privilege that society has given to you. So when we think about privilege, thinking about how people in dominant groups sometimes think that, other people could be just like me if they just worked harder. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But the idea is, the concept of, let's say, the American dream, right? If you just work hard enough, you're going to be able to make it, right? Or if you just go to school, if you just get educated, you're going to be successful. When the reality is that many people go into massive debt and can't even use their degrees because of such debt. Or, they work so hard, but they're not able to make it because there's bias against them based on the color of their skin, their gender, or other of these groups that I mentioned in the last slide. Let's see if I can do that. Yeah. Right? So you could be working really hard, and just because you're not being offered privilege means that, people are not treating you in the same way. So it's important that you know that privileges are unearned, and they're granted to people in dominant groups, whether they want those privileges or not, right? So whether or not you believe that you deserve this privilege, you get it because of the belonging to that group. And it's important that you become aware of your privilege so that you can use it to make change, to do better, and to make the world more equitable. Now, sometimes when we talk about privilege, people get upset because they think, my life was hard, right? I might fit into one or two of those groups, but my life was really hard, and you're telling me that my privilege is making it so that my life is better than other people's. So what I want to get across is that your life may have been difficult, but privilege means that your life was not made worse based on your identities, right? So things could have been worse had you held different identities. This concept that Ewurama Luo talks about is disadvantaged white people are not erased by discussions of disadvantages facing people of color, just as brain cancer is not erased by talking about breast cancer. They're two issues. They're different treatments, and they require two different conversations. So when we talk about things like white privilege, which is not the only kind of privilege that you can have, but when we talk about that, it doesn't mean that your life wasn't difficult or that you don't deserve things. It means that other people's lives are different and more difficult because they're not white, because they don't hold that privilege. And this last point, right, I've seen this a lot on the internet, right? Equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. It's not pie, okay? It's not, just because you help to create an equitable environment for everyone does not mean that your life gets worse. Actually, your life would get a ton better. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Sackey.
So we have, I guess, different groups going on. So we have dominant groups who get to create the culture and say, what is the norm, what other people get to be, and then we have others who have to try to ascribe to that. So if we think of the framework of white male supremacy, everyone is kind of invested in it, and everyone is trying to achieve a certain level of success, and that's based on what the hegemonic or dominant group says is. And so when we think of a dominant group, we think of a group that has the power to define or name reality and determine what is normal, real, or correct. When we think of the target group, we think of groups that are discriminated against, they're marginalized, they're disenfranchised, they're oppressed, they're exploited by an oppressor, and a lot of the feelings that they experience from the oppressor, they internalize. And then we get into terms such as gaslighting, and people self-gaslight. And so members of the target groups, their culture, their language, their history, it's misrepresented in our society. They're discounted. They are erased in a lot of spaces, and the dominant cultures group is imposed throughout. So because of internalized factors, a lot of individuals in dominant groups have unearned privileges, as Jessica spoke about before. All right, next slide. So oppression. When we think of oppression, we think of isms and microaggressions, or some people just like calling them aggressions, and they happen at all levels. And they're reinforced by societal norms, institutional biases, interpersonal interactions, and individual beliefs. So at the individual level, discrimination can occur because of an individual's feelings, beliefs, and values. At the interpersonal level, these can be actions, behaviors, and language. At the institutional level, which is sometimes harder for us to see, but I think especially with a lot of things that occurred last year and things occurring this year as well, we can see differential treatment in the legal system, the education system, public policy, hiring practices, media images, and then if we look at what's going on with COVID in the health system with different people of different colors receiving different care. In terms of societal and cultural, the collective ideas about what is right helps to create the system of oppression that we currently have. Next slide. All right, so at some point in their life, everyone has experienced being either part of the target or agent group, or some people have experienced both, maybe at the same time or at different times. So it's not to say that some target statuses are more salient than others. For example, some identities are a little more visible than others, but that doesn't mean that when you experience discrimination, that your discrimination is any less, or it's not as valid. Or for example, as we talked about with intersectionality. So as a Black woman, you know, I might feel something is racist and sexist at the same time, and I might feel as though one issue is a little more salient for me than the other. Or I might feel as though something is misogynoir, which is basically that something is racist and sexist at the same time, and feel both of those isms or discriminations equally. And discrimination based on identities creates a burden on the person who experiences it. They didn't create the discrimination or the system that they're within, but they have to deal with the burden of overcoming, say, like not getting a job based on identity, or not being able to get access to a certain building based on their physical ability, or not being able to read or write something based on their intellectual ability. Next slide. All right, so these are just examples here of oppressions, the target group and the non-target group or dominant group. And I'm not going to read through all of these for you, but basically different types of oppressions that we have, and there are tons of them. Maybe pointing out some of them that might not be as talked about as others, such as ability or ableism, thinking about the target group being people with disabilities, and then non-target group being people without disabilities. And really thinking of these like nuances, and sometimes we don't always think about the things we can't see. But also thinking about the things that we, so like, how do I fall into this or within this? But if you think about as, you know, as a white person growing up, maybe potentially you weren't middle or upper class, but it might be easier for you versus someone who is an immigrant from a country where when they come to the US, they are considered a visible minority. It might be easier for you to scale up, you know, through different socioeconomic statuses versus that person. So just realizing like where do I have the ability to move or go, and that gives me privilege. It might not be something that I hold right now or I held, but are there barriers in the way that versus other people? Like, do I have barriers that other people don't have, or do other people have barriers that I don't have? All right, next slide.
Oops.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about some microaggressions and what are microaggressions. And some people like terming these just like aggressions because we call them micro because they might not be very obvious, but they kind of have the same impact as like overt discrimination. So microaggressions, they were a term that was brought up to talk about like subtle or hidden or non-obvious forms of discrimination that people experience that they can't always name or point to, that the person who, you know, kind of does them might not see as obvious or might not intend to do them, but research has shown that the same kind of emotional or mental trauma exists with microaggressions that people have with overt discrimination. So microaggressions are everyday verbal, non-verbal environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely on their marginalized group membership. And that's from Psychology Today. So example for this statement, and a lot of people have said this, and it's a terrible saying, but saying like, that's retarded. Basically by saying that, you're saying that people with disabilities are slow, they're less valuable, important, likable, or competent than other people who might be considered abled, and you're equating them to being stupid. Next slide has some other examples as well. So telling someone who is a native English speaker, you speak good English. Or one that I get a lot is, well, where are you from? Where were you born? And I can say like, oh, well, I was born in Canada, so yes, technically it's a different country, but there's always the assumption that based on my name, I just immigrated here from a different place. Telling someone who is of color, oh, you're so articulate. Saying to a woman, oh, you don't act like a girl. Telling someone that you don't see their color. And that's basically saying when you don't see their color that the norm is whiteness and they've achieved that level of whiteness. And then saying to someone, you know, I never would have thought that you were gay is basically a form of heteronormativity, or saying like, oh, what's your boyfriend's name, when that person might have, you know, a girlfriend or someone from a different gender identity. And so really thinking about what we say, it's really important, but also like when we do make mistakes, saying, I'm sorry, or would you be able to walk me through that and help me understand how I might have offended you? So an example that we talk about a lot is like spilling coffee on someone. So like bumping into them, spilling coffee on them. You didn't intend to do it, but you did it, and you might have scalded them, you might have ruin their outfit for the day. And so really wanting to not do that again, but also to apologize for what you did, and to then, for the next time that it happens, try not to do it again. So we talked about intent versus impact. We don't always intend to hurt people or to harm them. And so intent is your motives. And our motives aren't always obvious to us or another person. And the impact is the result regardless of your motives. So when you consider your impact, you want to increase your effective interactions with other people. There are phrases that people use without understanding the impact they have. And so we have an intention, and in between that, we can have a microaggression that occurs. And it has an impact. And the most important thing that we want to look at is how what we say affects other people and how it makes them feel, so that we can then go back and work on our intentions. All right, next slide.
All right, so that brings us to what do you do? And Ewurama gave some really good examples of, things that we have all done, right? Without meaning to, that was not our intent. And again, the impact is what matters, right? You may not mean to hurt someone, and you might have hurt someone. So let's talk about how you can avoid doing that, and also what to do if you do that. So first things first, caveats. This is hard work. We are not trying to say that this is easy work at all, and it's going to be painful, right? I know for myself it's been painful. So, get ready, right? You're going to mess up. You're going to try these things. You're going to be so pumped after this training, and you're going to go out and try things, and it's not going to go well, and you're going to hate us. And then you're going to take a step back and realize that it's okay to mess up because you need to do it anyway, right? It's important that we do the right thing. And that's just what Martin Luther King said. The time is always right to do what is right. And that is a quote I live my life by. It's really important that we understand what the right thing is to do, and the right thing is to work toward equity and to not harm others. So we want to recognize that each person's identities are multifaceted, and that they're valid, that human beings are valid, that just because you've had an experience and someone else had the exact same experience, but they had a very different response than you, guess what? They're both valid. So it doesn't mean that you're wrong, or that your experience or your response was wrong, and it doesn't mean that theirs is either. There are multiple ways of engaging in different situations. So recognizing that other people may have a different experience in life because of their identities is the first step. If you do make a mistake, like Ewurama said, apologize. There's a great quote, and I quote her all the time because when I was making this training, I was reading this book, but I love these quotes. So Ewurama Luau, again, from So You Want to Talk About Race, she says, apologize. You've done something that hurt another human being. Even if you don't fully understand why or how, you should apologize. It is the decent thing to do when you respect people. You don't have to totally get it to know that you don't want to continue doing something that hurts people. So you don't necessarily have to understand in order to apologize. Understanding can come after. But if you're working to be a better human and working towards human equity, then you want to apologize if you've made a mistake, if someone's pointed out that you've made a mistake, whether or not you feel like it's a mistake. You want to understand that different people experience the world differently and move away from language that sees people as one thing. So, calling a group of people guys, this is a big thing that stands out to me now that didn't used to stand out to me. Calling a group of people guys when they're not all people who identify as male can be off-putting and does not recognize that there are other identities, and really stresses that men are the default, that's the default identity of humans is men. And so in an effort to not do that, saying things like, hey people, or hello humans, right? Which sounds so crazy because it seems to us like, we we almost have this, it makes us take a step back because it's like, well, what is it? Like humans versus aliens? Right? But it's not that. It's that you are accepting people for exactly what they are, which is human, and you're not making any assumptions about anything. When we do meet other people who are outside of our identities, it's important that we recognize that not everybody has the same goals or that their goals might look different. So for us, one thing might be really important and we expect everybody to feel like that thing is important. So if we are someone who came up and didn't have financial stability growing up, and that's really important to us to get financial stability for all. Right? Other people might have a different experience of financial stability and also might have a different experience about what is important in this world. So recognizing that what's important to you is important to you. What's important to others is important to others. And again, they're all valid. And so coming to terms with that, what you think is important doesn't necessarily mean is that it is more important than what other people think is important. One of the things that I've learned throughout this time in working in different groups doing anti-racism work is that a lot of folks don't know people outside of their comfort zone. So in Judaism, we talk a lot about Ashkenormativity, where, Jews are white and Jews are Ashkenazic. That's Jews from Eastern Europe, right? When that is not the case, right? There are Jews from all over the world. We know that. There's a whole song about wherever you go, there's always someone Jewish. So if that's the case, then, we need to step away from that understanding of all Jews are white, or that like when someone's name sounds Jewish, they must be Jewish, or that their Judaism looks the same as your Judaism. And so it's really important to get out there and to meet people who are different than you and to put yourself in different uncomfortable positions to expand your horizons and to learn more about other people so that you can learn more about other identities. Your experience is not anyone else's baseline but yours. And we often assume that our baseline experience, because, oh, well, I've known this person my whole life and I know their family structure and I know what their financial situation is. So that must mean that we're very similar and that we have the same identities. It's just not true. A lot of identities are not worn and are not discussed. And so you may not know what these other people's full identities are unless you ask. One of the things that also really stood out to me in doing this work is understanding and recognizing difference. I grew up in a time where we were told to be colorblind, that was the way to be, right? Don't see color. No, color doesn't matter. Well, it does. Just like Ewurama said, that's defaulting that white is the norm and that color is not the norm, and so you don't have to see it. So recognizing difference is okay. In fact, it's encouraged. The idea is that different doesn't mean bad, wrong, or worse, and it doesn't mean that you're better. And that's the difference between this whole color blindness and recognizing color, is that everybody's valid. Everybody's color is valid, their experience is valid. And so it's important to see it because that's part of who they are. That's part of how they engage in the world. When we are holding these meetings and we are trying to be inclusive, right? Even I was just helping to set up another meeting on anti-racism for later today, and I recommended they used the term post-racial, and we all agreed we didn't like that word. It was an old like list that we were working from with an old syllabus, and we said, oh, like we need a new word for this. And I said, how about inclusive? And someone said, well, inclusive means that there's already a group. There's already a group that you need to be included into. And my mind was blown. I had never thought about it like that. Here I thought I was being so, modern and anti-racist, and I had unknowingly used a word that really doesn't express what I wanted it to express. So thinking about the ways that we welcome or keep out people, right? And it could be, that was an example of how language can do that, but it can also be just in how we are with other people and what people feel comfortable with. We're all getting to know different levels of comfort through COVID because people have different levels of comfort, right? We are not given good recommendations from the government about how to proceed during this time. And so we're all kind of making it up based on what we know. And so it's the same thing, except forget the COVID part and just see it as a human thing where you're learning what makes someone feel welcome in a situation and what doesn't. You know, why doesn't this person ever want to come to lunch with you when we're back in person doing lunch? Right? Is it that potentially the way you're inviting them or the things that are discussed during that time are not what they want to be doing? Right? And so it's not that they're antisocial, it's that you're not making it a welcoming enough space for them. When people are kind enough to share their experiences with you, listen and validate. Whether or not you agree doesn't matter. It's all about tolerance and respect. Because again, no one's identity is more or less valid than anyone else's. No one's experience is more or less valid than anyone else's. And so when you are hearing someone else's story, you want to make sure that you're allowing, they clearly feel comfortable enough to be sharing that, and then you want to listen to it. Now, if you are close with this person, you can ask them, tell me more about that. Tell me a little bit more about this identity that you hold. And if not, Google is your friend. You can Google anything, right? And I'm not suggesting that the internet is always, I don't suggest going to like Reddit, but there are definitely resources out there to help you to understand why someone might not use a word or might not like when you use a word a certain way. You know, things that you never thought about, that never entered your consciousness, because that was, again, back to the intent versus impact. That wasn't your intent. And if it bothered someone, find out why, whether from them, if that feels like a safe thing to do, or by Googling it or doing your own research, asking other people that you do feel comfortable asking. So some of the things that I think are a little bit more globalizing in that are, we recognize, you're all here today because you recognize that we have a problem in this country with privilege and oppression and microaggressions, and you want to fix it. And so those are some ways that you can do that. But when you recognize it, you also need to fix it, right? It's not just recognizing, that's not enough. For all of us who went and read 1,000 books this summer about white privilege and anti-racism, that's awesome. And it's not enough. Because holding all that stuff up here doesn't do anything. Might make you feel good in here, but it's not doing anything to change what's happening in this world. And that's what we really want you to do, is to actually go out and change the world. So these are human issues. These are not issues because, I care a lot about, the homeless population. Great. You should care a lot about the homeless population. And you shouldn't care about them because they're homeless people. You should care because that's a huge issue. Housing is a huge issue. That is not just a problem in this city, but is a problem in this country, right? Housing is a human right. And we are not there yet as a whole. Right? So going out and doing something about that, understanding that this is a human issue. So maybe you do have a home and you do have enough money to keep that home, but a lot of people don't. So just because something doesn't impact you directly doesn't mean that it shouldn't be something that you take on as an issue, as a human issue. Someone asked in the sign up, how do you approach someone when they've engaged in a microaggression, you recognize it, or an aggression, when you've seen someone be aggressive toward another person, like, what do you do? And what you do is you call it out, because likely if you are able to recognize it and you hold a privilege that allows you to recognize it and to do something about it, that's going to be your best course of action. Right? If I am in a group of people and someone says something or uses a word that is inappropriate, say, ooh, that word is offensive, right? And I'm hilarious and, can get to people by humor. Not everybody is hilarious, and that's okay. So you can do it in the group, right? You can call them out in the group if that feels safe. You could call them out separately. You can say, hey, I want to talk to you about something you said during the meeting. You can use it as an opportunity to educate. I took this great training on privilege, oppression, and microaggressions. And I wanted to share with you that I learned that this word is not an okay word to use. It bothers some people, and I wanted to let you know. Now, you can't stop that person from doing anything, but the more you call it out, the more likely they are to stop using it, because a lot of people don't even know that they've done something wrong. When you are able to do that. Now, if you're not able to do that, then you can't. And sometimes you don't know. And that's the hard part, is that sometimes you might think that you can do something and you try and it doesn't work, and that's okay. That goes back to that slide about sometimes you're going to mess up. And that's okay, because then you at least tried it. You'll be more likely to do it again. You want to also make sure to work, and this goes back to this idea that just because something doesn't impact you, right? Like, I am physically able-bodied, right? So I don't think about whether or not a meeting is in a room that's wheelchair accessible, because that doesn't impact me. I should. We all should, because there's plenty of people that need larger spaces so that they can get through. So it's thinking about, like Ewurama said, who might be involved in this, and what can I do to make this space, whether it's emotionally or physically, safer for people that might be engaging in this space with me. So you want to bring injustice, even if you bring awareness to injustice, even if you are not seeing something happen necessarily right in that moment, but you know something, share it. Be an educator to people who you know and love. Hey, I learned this cool thing today. Or I'm reading this book and it taught me about this. Even if it's not something that you're seeing right in front of you, you could still teach people about it and get them talking about it, because the more we talk about it, the better off we are, because then we're more likely to make change or recognize in ourselves things that we need to make change with. If you do have wealth or political connections or that kind of privilege, use it. Use it to make change, to influence policy, right? Do what you can to change things on every level, interpersonally, in the government, in large groups. Do whatever you can. Use all of your privilege to do what is right. And advocate for these kinds of trainings to be held all the time, because y'all are amazing, because you're here today, and there's a lot of people that aren't. And it's not because they didn't get the invite. It's because they don't think that it's a problem, or they don't think they have a problem. So making sure that these trainings are mandatory in work environments, in school environments, whether that's higher education or just like elementary school, that needs to happen. And if you're a parent, advocate for that in your schools, because there are plenty of different kinds of people that your kids are going to school with that are feeling left out right now because nobody's talking to them about them. So before I move on to our daily action steps, I just wanted to ask if there are any questions, if people want to pop in the chat, or, it's a small enough group if you want to unmute yourself, if that feels okay. Or comments, if you'd like to share a comment.
I have a question. Oh, is my sound weird?
No, you're good. Elizabeth, please.
Okay. This is a great presentation. My question is, what do you do in a work environment where you're trying to purposefully create a committee with diverse perspectives? Like, I work in alumni relations, and so when I'm forming advisory boards, I want a board that reflects our current student population. I've really run into issues. I don't want to tokenize anyone, but at the same time, I want the perspective from our alumni of color. So how do you approach that type of situation and not make the person you're asking feel like you're only asking because they're Black, even though that is one of the reasons you're asking, because you really need that perspective on this committee?
I would honestly say to be very transparent with them and to say, like, this is an issue we're having. Is it within your emotional capacity to take this on? And I think that's the best way to approach someone. You might have some people say no, and you might have some people say yes. And if your goal is to like increase diversity somewhere, to increase representation, I think you have to be very intentional about it. And by saying like, this is an issue, this is a problem, people will always be willing to say, okay, they're noticing that this is an issue and a problem. I might be more willing to like make space for this, or I might have space for this, or I might be able to refer them to someone else who does have the capacity for this.
Yeah, I think that's
Great, thank you.
Yeah, it's a really important question and something that we struggle with in many areas. We struggle with this at work. We also, I'm on the Jewish Caucus for Reclaim Philadelphia, which is a political organization in Philly working for equity and thinking about how to diversify the people on the Jewish caucus, because again, it is very Ashken normative, and thinking about how to not tokenize people, but also how to target populations of folks that we are really interested in hearing what they have to say, because it's not what we have to say. And so I think it's a great question, and something that anybody who's trying to do any sort of group right now, I think, is running into, because everyone is going to respond differently. And I think Ewurama's point of like asking about their emotional capacity to take it on and being transparent is the best way you can do it. And you might still be met with people being upset, you know, so it's being able for you to hold that as like, I did the best I could, you know, and it still upset people. And sometimes that's how it's going to be, you know, and then potentially, you know, if that's someone that you want or have the ability to work through it with and talking to them about, you know, how you didn't want to upset them and the work that you did in order to make it as least upsetting. Thank you for that question. Other questions? Okay. So, yes, please.
So there's a big effort in my company to, bring more light to, DE initiatives and, making sure that there's equity kind of at every level of the organization. And the company is doing a great job, but then they encourage you to have kind of conversations at your team level. And during those team conversations, we'll look at a lot of statistics that show different, people of different ethnicities at different, like VP level, SVP level, director level, etc. And then what I find is, people who say, well, it seems like we're putting a lot of focus on equity for Black people, but Hispanic people actually have, less opportunities, and we have a smaller percentage of leaders at that level. So should we be focusing on, one specific group or another, and how does it seem fair that we have all of these initiatives? And then I don't really know how to respond in those situations, so it would be helpful to get some good, better language around kind of handling those situations.
Ewurama, do you want to start? Do you want me to start? No? So just to clarify, Mindy, so the issue is that you're wondering about is that your company is really focused on a specific group of people that they want to make more, like they want to increase equity.
It's more that, like, in the conversations, some of the, like, immediate leaders will say, well, like, we have, 30% of our executives are Black. So it seems like, if the target is to get us to have, like, 27%, we're doing really great there. So that's not a problem. It's, we don't have to focus on, making, like, promoting more Black people. We need to promote Hispanic people, or we need to promote, Asian people.
Yeah, so I always use this, it's a DBT, dialectical behavior therapy concept, but it's both and. So yeah, you're right. We do need to promote more Hispanic and more Asian people. And that doesn't mean we should stop promoting Black people, because even though, like, that is one, like, we're talking about race, and that's one identity that these people hold, and that's not who they are. And they hold all these other identities and are bringing so many different things to the table. So by looking at just Black people for being Black, you're missing out on so many other parts of them. And in that way are tokenizing them, which is problematic. The same thing with just looking at any race. And so I would try to expand the lens to, like, this is not an either or, it's a both and. And I would also look at, what is the main goal? Is the main goal that we want to increase and in this case, I think inclusive works because there is a group, right? There's the hired people at your company, and then there's the people that you want to either hire or promote. And so, what is the purpose of doing this? Is it that we just want to, like, look good? Or is it that we're, like, looking for these certain qualifications that people have? And are we holding, like, all of these pieces together, or are we just looking at it so that it's like the data really reflects what we are looking to do? I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just going back to, like, the pie, like, having people look at it as, like, this isn't pie. Like, we're not dividing up a whole of 100, that we can work on all of these issues at the same time. And as Jessica said, it's not just about representation by looks, but, like, what actions are we taking and, like, what impact are we making with the people that we have in place. So.
Thank you. I think the pie reference is so helpful, so I really appreciate that.
Oh, good. Yay, internet. Eric, did you have a question?
I actually did have a question. I was very, I don't know, when you said that colorblind is actually kind of outdated, that whole concept that we should be colorblind, I think of my job as an employment lawyer, and I think about the fact that if an employer is not colorblind and actually acknowledges color, they're basically asking to be sued. Because if there's almost no way that an employer could acknowledge the fact, could say anything or do anything that might acknowledge the fact that some people are different than others without basically facing liability. Because that employee will then say, yeah, they used to always say I could have off on Martin Luther King Day, but they didn't give everyone, they treated me differently. I wanted to work that day because that was the best day to get business, but they used to give me off, or I don't know, you get the idea. But just, even just making a comment like, oh, well, I don't even know what kind of comment you could say that wouldn't come across as being racist to some extent, or that someone could look at as being a microaggression. I think employers really just need to act as if they are colorblind. I don't see what the way around it is. I would love to hear how an employer could actually acknowledge and recognize people's differences without jeopardizing their, themselves from a legal perspective.
Ewurama, you want to start? Oh, okay. So, first of all, I think it's important to think about this, like, even before we get into that, to think about it on a more global level, that perhaps that's a problem with employment, right? So we should also think about it like that, and that we might need to work on that on a policy level. Because there are a lot of policies that don't make sense in employment, and protections that are not there that should be there for different kinds of people. So, but that's on a more global level. When we hire people, we look at differences of all kinds. We look at educational differences. We look at basically the differences that we're allowed to look at, right? And we're allowed to call attention to those. And so I think that when someone is coming in and offers a unique perspective, right? I think you could say unique perspective, and that means that they have something that other people don't have. Now, we don't have to talk about necessarily what that is, right? But it's because of all of their identities. It's not just because of the one identity that they're walking in the door with that you can see. So I think it's reframing it as like, I'm not hiring this person because they're Black. I'm hiring this person because of what they bring to my agency. They also happen to be a Black person who is maybe a Black female who identifies as trans, right? Like something that is probably not hired often enough, right? But I'm not going to say I'm hiring you because you're a Black trans woman. I'm going to say it's because you offer a unique perspective, because you bring something that nobody else is bringing to this team. Because that is the language that I would use for anyone who was coming in that was bringing a unique perspective, whether it was that they got educated in psychodynamic versus CBT, and my whole team does cognitive behavioral therapy and I need more psychodynamics, which is something that I could bring attention to. I don't think it's the best. I think we need to do more on the policy level around this. There are too many protections that are not in favor of humans.
I really think it comes down to the fact that people and lawyers teach people to be ultra sensitive to these things. So when someone says, and when someone comes in and starts explaining how they're trans, and then they say, "Wow, you have a very unique perspective," they've now just said that you're different than everybody else by saying that you have a unique perspective. And now that individual says, "Oh yeah, when I told them they were trans, they said, 'Oh yeah, you're unique,' even though that's not what I said. That's what they're going to say I said. 'Oh yeah, you're
Right.
unique.'" And now all of a sudden it's a case. Because people are so ultra sensitive about these things, it's just better for employers to just not touch it.
It's an interesting point. I wonder if that is what is best, or if that is just what is legal.
It's not what's best. It's what's best if you don't want to get sued.
Right.
But it's not what's best.
So
then
it is about changing this, because it does not sound like it is equitable.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't think there's any way to change it, because you don't want to change those laws and say you can no longer bring a claim and make the bar so high that you can't bring the claim until you can actually prove that the reason they made their employment decision that hurt you is because of your race, your religion, your sexuality, whatever it might be. You know, that will take away protection. So I don't think that policy-wise we're ever going to get to that. I think that employers are just, and everyone at work really is walking on eggshells.
I think you're right. I think they are walking on eggshells, and I think that it's also based on assumptions about where people are coming from, and that this kind of stuff has been used in the past to not hire people as opposed to hiring them. And so I don't know the answer. I don't know how to make that better, other than creating a community that understands and is open to having these conversations within, so that you can figure out the best way to do it for your company in a way that makes sense, and that, you know, you're working with your legal department to say, like, how do we do this? One of the things that I did in our employee assistance program is sent out it was a voluntary self-disclosure about therapists who provide therapy for our EAP, who identify as LGBTQ, who identify as Black, who identify as Asian, Alaska Pacific Islander, all the different identities, because patients are asking for that from their therapist. Now, it's voluntary, right? The therapists don't have to say, but that was a big legal thing because we weren't allowed to ask, but we could send out a voluntary survey, right, to get around the issue of legality. So I think that there are ways around it, but it needs to be on a small scale while we're working on the bigger scale stuff. Thank you. That is interesting perspective, because that's very different. Okay, so I want to talk about these daily action steps as a last, things to do. We gave you a lot of things to do today, and if you're interested, we can send out slides on, the things that you can do. But thinking about when you're having conversations, when you're engaging with other people, whether it's at work or in a group of friends, think about how much space you're taking up in conversations and in rooms when you're organizing things. How much is this about you and what you think and what feels good to you and what your privilege allows, and how much of it is open and safe for others? Are you actively working to improve space and access for other identities other than your own? How much do you know about other identities? Especially if it's people that you work with, people that you're friends with. How much do you actually know about the ways that they identify? And can you find out more? Either again from them or the Google. What assumptions am I making about others, and where did those assumptions originate? And what can I do about them? How do I change those? And lastly, thinking about who you're leaving behind. When all is said and done, who are you not thinking about at all, because you may not have anybody in your life that holds certain identities. And remember that these are human issues, and we need to make the world better for all humans. So to close out, Ewurama's going to read her favorite Martin Luther King quote.
So together, the reason that all of you have taken an hour out of your holiday to be here, thank you. So back in college, I did this program called Alliance and Understanding, and one of my friends, Dominique Huzon, did this program as well. And it's basically a college group, and there are many around the country that look at the relationship between African Americans and Jewish Americans during the Civil Rights Movement, and it visits different cities in the South. So Selma, Montgomery, Birmingham, Atlanta. And we visit different museums, synagogues, churches that were important in the Civil Rights Movement. The last place that we visited was the MLK Museum in Atlanta, and this was at the front of the museum on the wall. And it's just a quote that really shows why all of this work is really important. So when Dr. Martin Luther King was imprisoned, wrongly of course, and was writing letters from a Birmingham jail, he basically wrote in one of his letters, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." So I hope that this quote resonates with you as it has with me like a decade later, and really just encapsulates what's important and why, even if something doesn't affect us directly, why it should either offend us or move us or want us to do more to help people who aren't like us or to help people who are like us, because we're all in this together. Right.
Thank you all so much for taking the time. If you have questions that you think of, or, my email's incorrect there, but there's only one C in center. But if you want to contact us, please feel free. If you're interested in slides, please let us know. Thank you so much, and stay safe and take care of each other.
Thank you.
Come on, everybody. Round of applause. Let's unmute our